Okay, thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Jacquie Jacob, and I am the coordinator for the Community of Practice of Small and Backyard Flocks for e-Extension, which is the electronic version of the National Cooperative Extension Service. As part of our programming, we do monthly webinars related to small and backyard flocks. They're all recorded. This is being recorded and are posted on our YouTube channel. You can find the listing of upcoming webinars as well as the recordings for the webinars on our website, and I will put those in the chat box at the end of the program. Today I am both the host and the presenter, so we'll see if we can get this to work with minimal problem. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. If not, please let me know in the chat box that it is not the slideshow that you are seeing. So as I said, I am the presenter as well as the host. I will try and monitor the questions in the chat box and the Q&A, but it's difficult to, I only have one screen, so it's difficult to see the questions and do the presentation. But if I see something, then I will try and stop and answer the question. Otherwise, the questions will have to wait for the end. So the topic for today is disease prevention, which is typically done under biosecurity. This, of course, is a hot topic with all the problems that the US has been having with high-path avian influenza. The webinar won't deal specifically about high-path, although I'll make some comments at the end. It will be looking at disease prevention in general. Okay, let's see if it works. Okay, so biosecurity, it's a key term that you hear around all the time. It's basically a series of measures taken to prevent disease from entering a premises or from spreading within a premises should one break through. Of course, having a series of measures, if they are not taken, having it written down is not going to help. So understanding what your program is and following it are key. And everyone on the farm has to follow all the measures in the program. So we can start by discussing what are we trying to keep out? What are these disease organisms that we're dealing with? So they're bacteria, they're viruses, they're mycoplasma, fungi, protozoa, and other internal parasites, external parasites. All of these can cause disease, and we have to have a biosecurity program to keep these things out. Come on, why aren't you working? So how do they get in? That's the other thing. So we know what we want to keep out. So how do they get in? So some of the diseases are species specific. That is, they affect only one species. So examples I have here are infectious bronchitis and Marek's disease, which are diseases of chickens. So you have to watch out for other chickens bringing in those diseases. Some diseases can infect many different kinds of poultry. So for example, reoviruses can affect both chickens and turkeys. So you have to watch out for multiple species as sources of infection. Some can be harmless to one species, but devastating to others, such as blackhead in turkeys. The chickens can carry the protozoan, but don't typically show any signs. There have been cases in heavy infestations of chickens showing blackhead, but it's a devastating disease for turkeys. Some can infect non-poultry birds, which would include the companion birds like parrots and canaries, and also wild birds. So keeping wild birds out of the farm is very important. And some can infect a variety of vertebrates, including humans, domestic animals, livestock, and rodents. So controlling those are also important. So many people, to try and control rodents, will use cats, but cats can also be a source of some diseases. So it is not recommended to have domestic animals in with your chickens. Of course, if you are using dogs as a predator control, minimizing contact between the chickens and the dog is useful, but it would depend on how your predator control is being done. There are many other reservoirs of poultry disease. So while we like to see our birds eat earthworms, snails, slugs, whatnot, those can also be carriers of some poultry diseases, especially internal parasites. And so, you know, depending on where you are, you may not want them eating those. Some biting insects can transmit disease. That includes fleas, mites, ticks. Mosquitoes are a primary concern, especially for fowl pox. And again, some of the bugs that are consumed by poultry, sow bugs, crickets, grasshoppers, earthworms, darkling beetles, all can be sources of infection as well. So how do they get onto the farm? Feed can bring in fungi and bacteria, and the feed delivery truck, if you're getting it delivered, can also, if it's going from farm to farm, being carrying it. Your car, if you've gone to a feed store and been in contact with areas that have had other poultry people, you could also get it that way. Water can be a source from bacteria, fungi. I got bacteria down twice. Litter material, soil, and dust can all carry spore-forming organisms, especially some of the fungi that can be a problem. And then fomites, which are any equipment and things that can carry, they can carry the fungi, bacteria, and viruses. So if you're borrowing crates, if you're using incubators and brooders from flock to flock, if you're using shoes that have been in with other flocks, clothing from other flocks, and baseball caps are often forgotten, but they can also be a source of the problem. So how are diseases transmitted? Some are vertically transmitted. That means that it goes from the hen to the chick via the egg. So the hen becomes infected. She lays an egg with the infection in it, and the newly hatched chicks come out already infected with the disease. Horizontal transmission can be direct, where one bird infects the other through mucal sprays or other types of contact. They can be indirect by eating contaminated feed, or from being carried on your boots, or from mites, or from darkling beetles in the farm, and transmit it bird to bird that way. So a biosecurity program is what we developed to try and keep these organisms off of our farm. So one of the first goal is to, of course, have good management practices so that you can keep a healthy flock with a strong immune system. And the first thing is to provide the flock with fresh, clean, potable water. So this is not recommended. This is not recommended. So having a good water system with potable water, if you won't drink it, they shouldn't be drinking it. And birds won't eat if they can't drink. So a good supply all day long of potable water is important. So a number of different waters can be used. Nipple drinkers have become the most popular in the US commercially, as well as some backyard flocks are starting to do it. It's considered a closed system, so it's harder for the water to get contaminated. The hanging water on the top there can get infected with droppings, or the bird getting in there with its beak, if it was infected, could spread things to other birds. Choice of waters is important. The one in the middle shows how you can make sure that the water is cool all day long, or in the winter you can keep it from freezing. Nipple drinkers can be added to buckets, or they can be added to pipes and used as a efficient system for dispensing water to your flock. The other advantage of the nipple drinkers is that they tend to have less water spillage if properly maintained, and so litter management becomes easier. So the next thing is, of course, keeping the house clean, managing the litter to minimize moisture and ammonia production. And by managing your water, you can manage the moisture content of the bedding material, and that will control ammonia. It will also control coccidiosis and a number of other problems that can arise if the bird's respiratory system is impacted by ammonia. Feeding a quality balanced feed is important. Good nutrition is as important for your birds as it is for you. So it's important to feed the right feed specific for the type and age of birds in the flock. Don't feed a layer feed, which is high in calcium, to growing birds. They don't need that much calcium, and you'll end up with gout, end up killing your birds. Broilers need a higher protein than layer birds, that kind of thing. So always feed the right feed for the right type and age of the birds in the flock. The other issue that we often see is people try to make the feed cheaper by diluting it with scratch grains or cracked corn. Doing that dilutes all the nutrients in the feed, and therefore nutritional deficiencies can occur, and a strong immune system can be impacted, and you make the birds more susceptible to disease. So I've seen a lot of cases where people have done that, where they've diluted the feed as much as 50-50. A few handfuls a day as treats is not a bad thing, but make sure that you don't do too much. Also, make sure your feeders and waterers are at the right height so that they're not wasting it for you for economics, but also so that they're not pooping in it and causing other problems. Also, watch out for moldy feed. So check your feeders, make sure that it's not getting wet and getting moldy. So you should be cleaning, they should be cleaning it out, all the feed. Clean out the old feed before you add new feed. And if you get moldy feed, then the mold will produce toxins, and then you can get all sorts of health issues related to moldy feed. So watch out for that. Watch out for how you store your feed so that it doesn't get wet and doesn't get moldy. I'm sorry, I have an itchy nose. Okay, another goal, of course, is to place a barrier between the flock and the source of the infection. So the first thing to do is to start with disease-free birds. This is easy if you're doing it for the first time. Try and buy, sick, healthy birds that are disease-free. Don't go to swap meets, please, to get birds. This is how most diseases get into flocks, is buying birds of unknown source at a swap meet. Please don't do that. The preferred option is to buy day-old chicks from disease-free flocks. And an example is to buy from hatcheries that are participating in the National Poultry Improvement Plan. This is an American program, so it's not in Canada and definitely not in Algeria. It's a American program that is a cooperation between states and the federation, the federal government, to try and control diseases that are transmitted vertically. Remember at the beginning, I said some diseases are transmitted through the eggs, so that if the breeders are infected, the chicks will hatch out with the infection. So MPIP was started originally for Salmonella pylori, causes pylori disease. It was rampant in the United States, and so they started testing breeders and eliminating any infected breeders from the system. They then expanded it for Salmonella gallinarum, which causes fowl typhoid, and Salmonella enterica virus, variety enteritidis, which is actually a food concern for people. If your flock is infected, then it gets into the egg, which can make people sick. And then the mycoplasmas were added as well. So depending on what kind of birds you're getting, it is good to get one that tests through the NPIP program to remove infected breeders, so that your chicks are coming out of the hatchery disease-free. So there are a number of things that they can be screened for. So see what, depending on what your needs are, what kinds of screening you want on your day-old chicks. If you're buying in the United States and they're crossing state lines, you also have to, for most states, have to be avian influenza screened as well. So any bird, whether it's from NPIP or not, has to be avian influenza screened. And you could, they'll screen poultry breeding flocks, baby chicks, poults, which are baby turkeys, hatching eggs, hatcheries, dealers, all of those can be certified. And as I said, it's a cooperative testing and certification program run by the state and individually in each state with cooperation from the United States. In fact, they are all meeting in Texas at the moment, all of the state representatives, to discuss updates or changes to the program. So starting with disease-free birds, day-old birds is first. If you purchase older birds, try to get them from a well-known breeder, so that if you're getting them for the first time, it's not an issue. If you already have birds on the flock, on the farm, then you have to put them into quarantine. And I'll discuss quarantine later on. The other thing, as I said, keep out wild birds. So meshes over the open windows to keep them from coming in and building nests in your poultry house. Don't have wild bird feeders or bird baths near your poultry flocks, because it's going to attract them and can make them, can be a source of both the disease and the parasites that they carry. So the next step is to have dedicated clothing and shoes and the baseball cap, if you wear one, for the care of the flock. So don't wear your clothing, to visit other farms or other places. Have it specifically for your flock, especially the shoes. Preferably have some, rubber boots that you can clean easily and disinfect the bottoms of, but to prevent any transfer of disease with your clothing and shoes. If you have multiple ages on the flock, it's always best to care for the youngest first, and then work your way to the older birds. If you have, it's always best, to keep them separate. You don't want to put freshly new chicks in with older birds that are not their parents, or not their mothers anyway, because they could kill them as well as the disease. And you want to work your way up, to mixing them in as they get older. But you can see the farm on the right has multiple different poultry housing for breeding of different kinds of chickens. And so if you're doing that, always do the youngest birds first up to the oldest birds. And then of course you want to clean your boots before you go back the next day to look at the younger ones. Younger ones are more susceptible to disease than the older ones. You also want to restrict access to the flocks. So having a fence up is key. Here in the United States and in Kentucky in particular, we're not allowed to let any birds wander off our property onto somebody else's property, especially since chickens like to dig up flower beds. So you don't want them getting onto your neighbor's property. But it's always good to have a fence to keep people out, keeps out thieves as well, hopefully. But you also don't want to bring a lot of people to your flock, especially if they have other birds. And that can be companion birds as well as poultry. If you are letting people in now and then, it's good to keep a log of who has been on the farm, so that if something happens, you can trace it back to the person who came onto the farm and find out what disease was involved. And then you don't want to bring disease home. So the first step is to avoid or minimize your contact with other poultry flocks. So don't go from your flock to somebody else's. If you absolutely have to, then make sure that you're using clean clothing and a different set of shoes, or covering your shoes with little plastic booties that they get out there. So if visiting other farms, farmer meetings, feed stores where you might interact with people that have other poultry, use separate clothing, shower and change your clothes before visiting your flock. And you may need to wash your car and truck, especially the tires, if you are going to be on somebody's farm, or where you could pick up some contamination of poultry feces. Any equipment taken off the premises should be cleaned and disinfected before it gets brought back. So don't bring it back and then wash it, bring it back before you wash it. I mean, wash it before you bring it back. Sorry about that. Any equipment that you borrow from somebody else or purchase or whatever, make sure that it's disinfected before it is brought onto the farm. So if you buy, for example, some new nest boxes that somebody has, well, not new ones, but used ones that somebody else has been using, they've given them to you, make sure that you wash them, disinfect them before you bring them onto your farm or anywhere near your flock. Okay, so if you take birds to the fairs or exhibits, you have to be careful when you bring them back, because they've been in contact with other birds. It's always good practice to treat any returning birds for external parasites. You might not see them, but they may have picked it up from a chicken next door, or from the judge handling one bird to another when they're judging them. So it's always good to treat for external parasites, including the scaly leg mites, because you don't see those, and they cause damage to the legs, scaled legs, and especially if they're showbirds. And then you need to quarantine them before they join the original flock. And so what is involved in the quarantine? So it is best if they're housed in a separate building from the original flock, and they should always be cared for last. So make sure you have a good order on how you take care of the birds. Observe the birds for 3 weeks if the birds are incubating an infectious disease they picked up at the exhibit, it should become apparent within 3 weeks. If there is no clinical signs of a disease after 3 weeks, take a couple of birds from the original flock and put them in with the birds in the quarantine facility and observe for an additional 3 weeks. If there's no clinical signs after 3 weeks, the quarantine birds can go back in with the original flock. If the birds added to the returning birds, so the ones that from your original flock that you moved into the quarantine facility for that second 3 weeks, if they get sick, then the returning birds most likely have an asymptomatic disease that they picked up while away. If the returning birds get sick, but your original flock may have recovered from something while the birds were away and have now passed it on to the naive returning bird. So 3 weeks, 3 weeks. If you're adding new birds to an existing flock, so the preferred option would be to get fertile eggs from an NPIP flock and hatch your own birds. That's the best way of making sure that you're disease free. But the second best option is to purchase day-old birds from the NPIP hatchery. And of course, they have to be brooded, so they're going to be separate from the original flock. Always do them first so that they are not getting something from the older birds. And the last option is to purchase older birds from a well-known breeder and quarantine. Quarantine is similar to what we did with the returning birds from an exhibit, only it's a little longer. So observe the birds for 4 weeks. It should be within 4 weeks there. And then if no clinical signs, take some of your birds away from the original flock, put them in with them, see if they get sick. And again, depending on who gets sick, you can tell who had the asymptomatic disease. It's 4 weeks because you don't know the disease background of the birds that you're bringing. The ones that you're bringing home from the poultry show, you know the history from when you had them, and it's just the time that they were away. None of those methods is a 100% guarantee you won't bring something back, but it's the way to minimize it the most. So the other goal is to prevent the spread of disease on the farm. So the first step is to know the clinical signs of disease and act quickly if these clinical signs appear. And so what are the signs of disease? For some, it's just a sudden death. If you have a large flock, it's good to keep daily mortality records. It's not unusual to get a bird here or there that dies, but by monitoring mortality, you can see if there is a slow increase in mortality. And of course, if you get a large number of birds die, you definitely are going to notice that. Reduced feed consumption. So it's always good to keep good daily feed consumption records, know how much feed they're consuming every day, so that if the feed consumption drops, that's often an initial sign that something's wrong. It could be that the water has a problem, because if they can't drink, they won't eat. So it could be a management or facility issue, but it could also be the early signs of a disease problem. So keeping good records is also always important. And one of the things that they noticed with the current strain of avian influenza that is happening right now in the US was a drop in water consumption. So keeping an eye on your water consumption can also be important. And of course, that's even if they have the water there. If they start consuming less of it, then it may be the initial signs of avian influenza. That doesn't mean it is. It could be. Reduced bird activity. So if they just don't look like they don't want to move around much, that could be an issue. make sure they're just not sleeping or sunbathing or something like that. But if they don't move when you move around the pen, something's wrong. Always monitor the manure consistency. Make sure you know what normal looks like and what abnormal looks like, so that you can notice any changes in the consistency. That can often be an indication of something wrong. What could be a disruption in the feed, or it could be an intestinal problem in the bird. So keep an eye on the manure consistency on a daily basis. Look for respiratory signs that can be, so that's also listening for respiratory signs like sneezing, snicking, which is another, it's like a reverse sneeze, gasping for air, nasal discharge, coughing. Any of those are a sign of a respiratory disease. Look for swelling of tissues around the eyes or the neck. These are two similar breeds of chickens, but the one on the left obviously has swelling near the wattles. So keep an eye on that. Handle your birds. Now, pick them up, look at them, make sure that they aren't showing any signs of disease. It could be nervous disorders, muscular tremors, dripping of wings, twisting of the head or neck, incoordination, paralysis. All of those are signs that something is wrong. So make sure that you know what to look for, and anyone who's caring for the birds also knows what to look for. To prevent the spread of the disease, remove and dispose of any dead birds properly. Approved disposal methods vary from state to state, so make sure you check with your state veterinarian's office or your county extension agent to find out what the disposal methods are allowed in your area. Most states allow home flock owners to double bag a dead bird and place it in the home trash. If you're getting a large number of dead birds, that may not be the case. And if you're getting a large number of dead birds, you may want to contact the state veterinarian's office to make sure you don't have a contagious disease. For small commercial flocks, that could be composting, it could be burying. Again, it varies from state to state. So make sure that you check with your state veterinarian's office. Rodent control is extremely important. Aside from the fact that they will consume feed that you have paid for, they can spread disease. So properly store feed in metal cans with tight lids to keep out rodents. Clear away debris, tall grass, and bushes from around the poultry house so that they're not getting to the house easily, and have a rodent monitoring program to make sure that you know whether or not there are any rodents running around or not. This is a farm from Minnesota. When I used to work there, they used to mix their own feed, and this was how they stored their feed. And big surprise, they had a major rodent problem on the farm. They also processed their own chickens, and they were having a salmonella problem with their HACCP plan for processing. So their first thing that they had to do to solve their processing problem was to change their method of storing feed. To prevent the spread of disease on the farm, you need to manage the outdoor access. You need to prevent mud buildup. And so a lot of it depends on how many birds and how much of an area. So the three on the left are the left one is a nice free range where they have lots of area so that the birds are not denuding the area of pasture. The one on the right is a fixed house, and the birds will only go a certain distance from the house. Sometimes 300 feet, sometimes 500. They're obviously putting things out to encourage them to go out, but they'll only go a certain distance. And so if you have a high concentration of feed, they will finish up all of that pasture very quickly. And then if it rains, you can get mud. And then if it's been there for a while, you can get fecal buildup as well. And of course, if you have a small flock with a confined bird population, you're not going to have any grass in there, but try to make sure that the rain's not getting in and building up and flooding your area there. So if you're using outside free range, make sure you rotate your pastures. Don't give them access to the whole thing. Let them move around and allow the pasture to recover before you put more birds on. Proper handling of the used litter and or manure. Again, this is one of those things that regulations vary from state to state on what you're allowed to do. Composting is often recommended for in most states for the home flocks. Aside from the fact that it's a good way to manage the manure, it also provides you with an excellent fertilizer. Once it's composted, it can be used on both vegetable and flower gardens. Great nutrient supply, nice organic matter, and a nice fertilizer for your gardens. Clean and disinfect poultry house and equipment. So we did a webinar a while back on choosing and using disinfectants for small and backyard flocks. It's on our YouTube channel. And I'll try and remember to put that in the chat box when we finish. But some of the key points from that webinar were the removal of the biofilm. So you get that slimy stuff on the equipment, that's got to come off. Then you can select a disinfectant for the type of material being cleaned, and make sure that you use the required contact time. Sometimes the disinfectants require a certain amount of time on the equipment before they are effective. So that webinar goes into great detail on cleaning and disinfecting poultry houses. Waters should be cleaned daily. They don't necessarily need to be disinfected, but they do need to be cleaned daily. Again, if you're using the nipple drinkers, it's a closed system. That's usually not an issue. Make sure the flock has the fresh feed and water daily. Clean and disinfect any equipment that comes into contact with the birds or their droppings. Again, remove all the organic material first, wash with the detergent and rinse, and then apply the disinfectant. A disinfectant does not make up for not cleaning and removing the organic material, the dirt on it first. And then you should have a plan should a problem arise. So if signs of illness are detected, you need to know what to do. So it's typically recommended that you consult your local veterinarian, and I'm well aware that most places do not have veterinarians that take poultry. So, find out who you would ask if something happened. And it may be necessary to submit the birds to the state diagnostic lab. Almost all states have a diagnostic lab for animal diseases, and they will do a post-mortem examination and get you a definitive diagnosis. Kentucky requires that birds be submitted through a veterinarian, although if you work with the diagnostic lab, and because you don't have a veterinarian, they will work with you. So make sure that you know who's the contact if something happens on your farm. Know ahead of time, not go, trying to figure out what to do once the problem arises. And briefly, I just want to say something about the avian influenza. Everybody hears about high path. There are different types of avian influenza, low path and high path. Of course, the high path has high mortalities with some hemorrhaging in the tissues often seen. It's caused by an avian influenza virus. And the key thing is that those little spikes that come out of it, the neuraminidase and the hemagglutins, or the H's and N's we call them, and then the RNA that's inside it, they can RNA test birds to, viruses to determine where it came from. but the N's and the H's are important in the nomenclature. So there are 16 different H types and 9 N's. So there's a variety of different combinations that they can have. So right now we're having the H5N1. And the highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses are typically an H5 or an H7. I haven't seen any that aren't an H5 or an H7. Not all H5s and H7s are high path, but all high paths seem to be H5s and H7s. There are low paths that happen every once in a while. And so any of those others besides the H5 and H7 can be low path. So high pathogenic just means that the disease is really bad. High mortality, you basically lose your flock in 5 days. As I said, H5 and H7 types. The low path can be milder. You may not even know that you have it, and the disease may not have, they may not die from the avian influenza. It may be a secondary bacterial infection that happens. The commercial meat industry here in the United States, every bird is, not every bird, flocks are sampled to make sure that there is no avian influenza in the flock before they are shipped to processing facilities, so they're not spreading any of the low path disease, avian influenza viruses around. So that we monitor it very quickly, and in many cases of low path outbreaks, they don't even know they have it. The birds don't appear sick. They just got tested by the routine testing needed in order to ship birds, and then they found it. So what will cause an outbreak of avian influenza? Basically, you need a reservoir of the high path avian influenza virus. You need a vector that's going to transmit it to a susceptible population of poultry, whether that be small backyard flocks, wild birds, or large commercial operations. And the main vector for transmitting these viruses is migratory waterfowl. So these are some of the routes worldwide of migratory waterfowl, and they all meet up in the north. And if some birds are infected and the H5N1 that was causing people to get sick was an Asian variety, for example, if it gets up and mixes with the American flyways, then you're gonna get transmission of the disease. So it's easy for a virus that showed up, in one area to suddenly show up in another, totally unrelated, a different continent because of the commingling of the waterfowl. In the United States, we have 4 main flyways: the Pacific, Central, Mississippi, and Atlantic. The outbreaks that we first started to see were in the Atlantic, including in Canada. And then the Mississippi flyway has had some, and then now some of the states in the Central are starting to. I don't think there's been any commercial in the Pacific, although wild birds have tested positive. Okay, so just to summarize on disease spread, you have an infected premise. It can be the movement of infected birds. It can be the movement of people. It can be a movement of vehicles. It can be from wild birds, from the wind. Insects, rodents can all transmit the disease. It can be a fecal oral route or an aerosol route, depending on the type of infection. So this is from the USDA program on keeping your birds safe. Keep your distance, restrict access to your property. Again, consider fencing off the area to keep your birds and make a barrier from people. Don't allow anyone who's not a caretaker onto your farm. Try and keep out game birds and migratory waterfowl, because as I said, they can carry disease, especially waterfowl with the avian influenza. Keep it clean. So, wear clean clothes, scrub your shoes with a disinfectant, wash your hands, clean cages, make sure that you're getting fresh food and water, remove manure, properly dispose of dead birds, all the things we talked about. Don't bring the disease home. So if you have any interaction where there are other bird owners, make sure you clean yourself before you go in there, and try and clean your car if you need to. It's always a good reason to get kids to wash the car. And new birds should be separated from the flock for at least 30 days, which is more or less 4 weeks. Don't borrow disease. So if you're borrowing equipment, such as these crates here, don't bring them back without cleaning them first. Make sure that you know all the signs of disease. Some of the ones we didn't talk about can be a drop in egg production, or soft and thin-shelled misshapen eggs. That's always a problem. So keeping good egg records are also important. You only have a handful of chickens, that may not be an issue, but if you have larger numbers, 1 egg a day lower, you may not notice it till you've gotten 5 or 6 eggs a day lower. So keeping track of your daily egg production is important so that you can notice a problem. So feed and mortality records and egg production records are always important. Look for any discoloration in the skin from the wattles, combs, and legs, and look out for the neurological signs, which could be the Newcastle disease. So early detection is always important to prevent the spread. And if you find a problem, make sure you know who to call ahead of time. So that's my presentation. We have 10 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, make me stop sharing. I think I stopped sharing. Yes, I did stop sharing. So are there any questions? Still kept a few people around. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. So feel free to type it in the chat box or the Q&A. I try to, think about what you need to look at to protect your flock. And you need to protect it whether you have 5 chickens, 500 chickens, 5,000, or 500,000. The same principles hold true for whatever flock it is. And there are, backyard flocks have been just as affected by the high path avian influenza as the large flocks. Question: what is the current disease outlook for poultry in the US? Any big outbreaks on the horizon? Well, we're still dealing with the avian influenza. That's going to be there for a little while longer. It started to go down as the migratory fowl move on. Still having a few outbreaks in Pennsylvania, which is on the Atlantic. The only other one that we have had issues in the past is the Newcastle disease, and that was mostly in California because of birds fighting cocks going across the border to fight in Mexico, where they have it endemic. And so I don't think any other poultry diseases have shown any likelihoods. Most of the commercial flocks are vaccinated for major ones that, like ILT, laryngotracheitis, but I don't see it being any other issues. We just got to keep dealing with the avian influenza. Here's one question here. Are chickens less likely to get diseases free ranging or more? So free ranging, you are opening yourself up to interaction with wild birds. So the minute you open them up to wild birds, they're more likely to get infected. If you have a lot of area, you manage your pastures so that you're not getting a lot of water buildup, so you're not having mosquitoes. That's going to help a little bit. If you keep out areas, you know, so that the migratory fowl are not out there, if you're watching to make sure that wild birds are not feeding from your chicken feeders, then that will help keep it down. But anytime you have them outside, their access to wild birds, then it's an issue, which is why in Europe, when they get a high path avian influenza outbreak, they mandate that all the birds have to stay inside. Even the free range type chickens have to stay inside so that they're not getting in contact with the migratory birds. So in terms of Marek's disease, it's also called range disease. So, you know, the fact that you're out there and access to wild birds, you're gonna get it. Even though the wild birds don't get sick, they can carry it. So Marek's disease is everywhere. If you're gonna free range, it's always a good idea to vaccinate for Marek's at day of hatch. If you don't do it day of hatch, too late. Any other questions? We still have to, oh, I was gonna put in the website. Copy this, whoops, put it in here, whoops, so that is our website. It has links to the the upcoming webinars, and next month's webinar is July 5th, which is external parasites. I'm back on August for basics of poultry genetics. And then we have some breeding of purebred poultry, litter management, making your own feed, and an overview of chicken anatomy. And all of the past webinars that were recorded, you can also access them through that website. And we also have a Facebook page for the group, and we put in upcoming events. We also do news items, so you know, we keeping them posted. When we had the with the avian influenza outbreak, letting people know where things were going on. So if you want to, let me find the website. Here we are. If you want to monitor who has what in terms of avian influenza, USDA has a website. And if you go to that website, which I'm sharing here, it lists the commercial and backyard flocks as well as the wild birds. And so, where are you? Still updating. So far, there have been 361 confirmed flocks, with 184 of those being commercial flocks and 177 being backyard flocks. So 36 states have been affected, and I see that the Pacific Flyway has also been affected because, oh yeah, now I remember, there was even a case in Alaska, a backyard flock in Alaska, and then Washington and Oregon as well. And you can look up by your state when one was, and I see that North Dakota backyard producer with 30 birds was the latest, which was yesterday. Ducks have been affected, and you can see all the backyard flocks here in Washington, Georgia, Minnesota, Idaho, oh God, Washington's really getting affected. I'll have to pay attention to that. Even some turkeys have been affected. So you can monitor what's happening in your area as well. And obviously it has not gone away yet, because that was that one case on the 6th. So you can see you only had 30 chickens, but they still had the problem. So, and a lot of times, you'll know you have it because all your birds died. So help out your neighbor. If you do get some mortality, make sure that you report it so that they can know where it's at and properly dispose of all of your dead birds. So, okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A, and no more questions in the chat box. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to close down the recording.